This afternoon we're going to talk about virtualizing macOS at scale for iOS DevOps. It's a fairly unique area for us because there aren't a whole lot of companies that host Mac computers. I've got a great panel joining me today, both from enterprise class companies, service providers, and MacStadium's resident VMware expert on the end. With me right here is Ray Sennewald, Senior Software Engineer at Box. Next to him is Alex Niederberg, Senior Manager and Lead Software Engineer at Capital One. And then Josh Calderemus, Vice President of Product at Travis CI. And then Preston Lazenbiken, the Lead Systems Engineer for MacStadium. I'd like to let each of these folks tell you a little bit about themselves and about their environments that they're managing on a daily basis.
Yeah, sure. So I'll get started. So again, my name is Ray. I work at Box. I'm a senior software engineer, but I specialize in build and release for the applications engineering teams. So particularly macOS and the macOS team as well as the iOS team. So I help support their CI infrastructure, which includes MacStadium. So yeah.
Hi, Alex. I'm at Capital One. I work on a team that does tools for the mobile engineers across the US, the UK, and Canada. And we're ultimately looking to provide tools both on MacStadium and AWS to empower our mobile engineers to ship features to customers.
So my name's Josh. I'm one of the founders at Travis CI. I work heading up the product side of our development. At Travis, we provide developers a software as a service solution to continuous integration and continuous deployment. So essentially, as developers, you will want to test your software on a environment as similar as to your development machine, while we need to run untrusted code with untrusted code with untrusted code across Linux and Mac. So we do this across MacStadium and our Google Compute for Linux.
Cool. I'm Preston. I'm the lead systems engineer at MacStadium. My main focus is supporting customers and troubleshooting problems that can arise with VMware running on Apple hardware.
Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Just talking a little bit about MacStadium for those of you in the room who have not heard of us or really know what we do. We're the only provider of enterprise class hosting solutions as infrastructure as a service. AWS doesn't do it. Google Compute doesn't do it. Azure doesn't do it. And Apple doesn't do it. So primarily, we've taken the form factor of the Mac Mini and the Mac Pro, added some innovation to it, and basically gave it a new life as a data center computing asset. So we've built the basically resource pool for Macs. Where that comes into play is really why Macs. I mean, I get this question a lot when I'm at a conference or at a bar. They say, "You host Mac computers?" We say, "Yeah, we got 20,000 of them." And principally because we respect the fact that if you really want to develop rich iOS applications, you really need to use Xcode. Xcode is part of macOS. macOS only runs on genuine Apple hardware. And that's why MacStadium exists. Other cloud providers, as I said, don't really do this. And what we also find is that managing these basically disparate Mac resources internally is hard. And so we try to make that easier. So why VMware? A couple of years ago, one of our customers who was basically running bare metal on MacStadium said, "Hey, can I run VMware on this?" We were already a VMware partner, a global partner. So we said sure. And through that iteration and through those experiences, we've continued to build upon how to improve the performance of those Mac resource pools in an enterprise class environment. I'll let these gentlemen talk about each one of those scenarios for their companies and how they sort of are using the best practices, the best tools to decrease build time, increase efficiency and operational excellence. And actually VMware today is really the only virtualization option for Mac. There are a couple of other small startups that really fall short when you're really trying to build something at scale. So right now, I'd like to turn some of the questions over to the panel and have each of you sort of give us your story. Please say a few words about the CI infrastructure that you have running on Macs in your environments.
Yeah, sure. So at Box, we've got MacStadium as our infrastructure provider for Macs. We use Jenkins as our CI platform, and we use the vSphere plugin for Jenkins, which allows us to do some cool things, specifically give us one-time use builds with our VMs. So what we do is we actually use Terraform to build out all of our VMs, so infrastructure as code. With a little bit of scripting, we add those as nodes to Jenkins, and then using this plugin, we can allow the VMs to revert back to snapshot after every build. So it gives us container-like functionality, but for macOS. And that's something we wanted to have at Box. We wanted to have a clean environment for every build, for every developer, because otherwise you're just going to run into problems.
So at Capital One, we use a mix of GitHub Enterprise, Jenkins, and then hardware that we run on MacStadium. We also use Terraform. We use Terraform plus Ansible to be able to provide VMs that live for about a week. What that ends up providing to a lot of our development teams is they can go and build, have pull request patterns that run through GitHub. That gets executed onto slaves that are connected to Jenkins. And ultimately, we provide a standardized VM where they can run both their Mac builds or their iOS builds and also their Android builds. That's a lot of what we're actually providing to these teams is being able to run. We usually run 3,000 or 4,000 builds a day, and we run a lot of those by providing these VMs that are refreshed after the builds.
So at Travis, we're using MacStadium as well, as you can probably guess. We run 84 Mac Pros across 2 different vSphere clusters for HA, for failover. And across that, we're doing 10 different images, because with CI, when you're testing open source, you're essentially testing against what developers might be using. So you want to test against different Xcode versions or different Swift versions. And so we provide various different versions of these. And then across a day, we're doing about 54,000 VM starts. So we're starting up a fresh VM, throwing it away afterwards, running it for about 6 minutes on average, throwing it away. And 70% of our workload is for open source. So we can help the open source community test their software better for free, because no one wants to really pay for, a Mac to sit in a basement when you're just working on some open source. So we provide a lot of infrastructure for the open source community while also having a commercial offering.
So obviously, a lot of our customers tell us that the real value that they're really driving out of the Mac infrastructure is being able to virtualize it. Tell me what sort of entered into your decision making when you were running bare metal versus moving over to a virtualized environment.
This was actually a decision that was made before me coming to Box.
Got it.
But I was very happy to know that that was the case when I started there. I've been there for about a year. At my previous organization, we managed a set of Mac Minis, and I say we, but there was really no clear ownership of it. Developers didn't want to maintain it, but they needed it for testing. My team, which was the CI infrastructure team, wanted to maintain the software on there, but we didn't want to maintain that the host was online. And IT really didn't want to maintain it because it was drastically different than everything else in their server room. So it was a real big pain point for us. So I'm glad whatever happened in the decision making at Box that they came to this decision, because it makes my life a lot easier, but also developers as well.
And at Capital One, my team kind of came to be where we realized we were investing a lot in being able to deploy and keep infrastructure running in different cloud providers. And we were also investing a lot in mobile development. We at the time had, a Mac that we were running, and it really wasn't a stable platform for those developers to be able to push changes through. So ultimately, we realized it wasn't sustainable to try and manage bare metal machines, and ultimately to have something that could run through virtualization really empowered us to provide a consistent environment where developers could get their test results through and make sure that the code was staying stable before it was shipped to customers.
And for us, bare metal has never been an option, because with CI, when you're running other people's code, you're running, you may be running customer 1 and then the next build is customer 2. You cannot have leftover artifacts. You can't have any of the file system changed or log files left over. So it's all about having a clean room, sandboxed environment. So VMs is very important for how we do this in a secure fashion. It's, even if you take away this whole container discussion that kind of happens on the Linux side, that's not what CI is really aimed at either, because we need security is very paramount for trust on a multi-tenant environment.
Excellent. Tell us a little bit about some of the advantages, or sort of how your clouds and your deployments are configured in MacStadium today, using 6.5 or link clones or ephemeral builds. Just sort of the different types of ways that your environment exists.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of touched upon it a little bit already, but essentially we just use regular clones using VMware, but in vSphere 6.5, it's been much faster. I believe this is also due to storage improvement, which I think we'll get into a little bit later in the conversation. But we use Terraform to provision these, and we connect them to Jenkins, like I'd already mentioned. So that's pretty much the meat and potatoes of how we do it.
We are also operating on VMware 6.5. We have a process where we take an existing VM, we'll add new versions of Xcode and other tools that the developers need. A lot of our process is tied in to use Fastlane. So we'll also keep our VM and be able to basically enable the developers to select the version of Xcode that they need for their run, and then be able to execute that in this standardized environment.
So we use 6.5 as well. We're not using snapshots. We are using the new SAN environment. So, in the multiple upgrades that we've gone through with MacStadium as we've increased our load and expanded, we've been focusing on how do we get our boot times down, how do we make sure that we've got less spikes, less peaks. We do use Terraform and Packer for a lot of our building of the VMs, but we're starting VMs fresh, so we take a little bit of a penalty for this because of the different images that we're also starting at the same time. So because we're not just starting one image, we can't go through a suspend resume kind of state, or a snapshot. We start everything from fresh, and we'll take about a 60-second penalty, and this is, I know that there's some discussion coming up in a later question about some of the enhancements that are coming with this, but working closely with MacStadium, we've also gone through some SAN improvements which have decreased this from like 3 minutes down to 60 and brought us huge speed improvements over the time.
Yeah, Preston, we've heard from a lot of our customers, it's about speed and performance and build times and those kind of things. What are some of the things that MacStadium is putting in place in terms of SAN, in terms of other networking topology to sort of enhance or to improve that the performance?
Okay. So originally we're using certain SAN arrays like NetApp, for instance.
Spindle-based.
Yeah, spindle-based basically. And they're a little bit older, and of course the throughput and IOPS that you can get out of something like that was much, much lower. It got the job done at the time, but there's lots of newer technology, so we finally got around to basically replacing everything with all-flash storage, which I'm sure any of these guys can tell you there was a massive increase in performance of switching to flash storage. Throughput, build times cut down by minutes. Massive factors of time completely changed. We've gone through several network upgrades, one to include of moving off of older Cisco gear, going into a new topology off of the standard campus style and moving towards VXLAN. So it's mainly, your standard Cisco 9K series using VXLAN. The throughput completely changed. Instead of having like your entire backbone east to west, having the capabilities of, let's say, 10, 20 gigs, internally right now we're running at 160 gigs throughput east-west. Just that simple topology.
So and I know, Preston, you've looked at 6.7 and are basically rolling out on a limited basis right now. Are there some of those performance and improvements that the network is providing evident in 6.7?
So with 6.7, what I've seen is they've made several tweaks that will help developers running on MacStadium be able to create these builds much, much faster. There have been changes to things such as the cloning process, which originally comes from VMware's VDI. That's the API that most of these developers are actually hitting. Yeah. It's using the exact same process. So there have been little changes and tweaks to the ability to segment out how a clone works. For instance, 6.5, that, it needs to be called VM fork, and then, now it's actually fully titled, instant cloning. So the change was, I have a base image, and I want to make clones of that from the parent, and now I'm running off of the child image. In 6.5, they had a very tight relationship in which if you do anything to that parent image, you'll basically break the linkage between any of the child clones. In 6.7, that new performance that they've given to you is now you can add things like HA, DRS, and you can make changes live. You no longer have to do a freezing of that clone, because essentially what you have to do is you build your original image, your golden image, save it, turn it off, power it off, and that's it. You don't touch that. Now you can make immediate changes, and it's a marked difference. It definitely creates a lot of easeability for people to be able to run things now.
Yeah. You mentioned all flash send. I know that at MacStadium we have all standardized on Pure. There's actually an exhibitor here this week. It seems to have all the right security, has all the right performance, has all the right aspects to really optimize environments. I'd like to hear from each of the panelists to tell us how that changeover from the older NetApp storage, how that affected your builds and how that affected your performance.
Yeah, so it was huge for us. So like I said, we have around 4 templates, and we end up provisioning 100 VMs from that. On the old NetApp, it would take us, and this was running an older version of vSphere as well, I believe it was 6.0, it would take us 20 to 30 minutes to clone 1 VM. And with 6.5, and with the Pure storage, we were able to get that down to around 10 seconds on average. So we could re-provision our whole fleet of VMs in 10 minutes now, which is awesome for us because now we can accommodate changes a lot easier. We really don't want to maintain state on these different VMs. So if we wanted to upgrade Xcode, for example, I want to just blow away all these VMs and re-provision them. And that's what Terraform's really good at doing. And snapshots are really fast for us as well. So it really allowed us to take advantage of this model that we were working on. And it's huge for us. Previously, we really just wouldn't accommodate Xcode upgrades unless we absolutely had to. So developers would be at my door begging me, hey man, can we get Xcode 9.2? And I'm like, that's going to take us a lot of work. So now it's a lot easier for us. So it's really nice.
Yeah, we have a similar process where we try to stay a little bit closer, I think, as you guys do, to the Xcode releases, even to try and get some of the betas out there for our teams to use. And we saw when we shifted to the all-flash array, the time to actually go from the template we generate within vSphere to provisioning it went from 20 minutes to about 20 seconds. So it was a huge improvement in terms of being able to have these things up and running and be able to refresh them a lot faster.
So we went from 10-minute spikes down to a 1-minute average. And for us, this was a massive improvement because when you're dealing with 55,000 jobs per day, those spikes matter a lot. Across the 10 different images that we had as well, it meant that it was much more reliable with the caching, with SAN as well, and how we also did our different slicing across the clusters. And it's just been, I guess more important for us is the whole build versus buy. And what I mean is, instead of running this internally, it's been much more effective for us to work with a partner on how best to understand how to scale VMware and how to scale that effectively across essentially a fleet that is continuing to grow. Because as our customers grow, I don't want to spend time within our organization of building the infrastructure. I want to work with a partner on how best to build that infrastructure. And so, by going from NetApp to the SAN and what we're at even before that, we wouldn't have been able to do that ourselves without working with an effective partner.
I'll actually layer onto that a little bit. That was another thing that went into our decision process, was we didn't want to have spare Mac hardware on hand. So one of the things as we were trying to figure out how we wanted to solve this problem, it's nice to have a partner who ultimately has spare Macs and has 24/7 hands to go and fix stuff. So that was something that allowed us as a team to focus a lot more on providing the software and the tools and being able to help on the fast lane side and optimizing and dealing with some of our network considerations as opposed to dealing at the hardware level.
Also, one of the things, obviously, since we've started into this hosting Macs, sort of bare metal, and then adding virtualization later onto it too, It's feedback from customers and clients and partners like this that has allowed us to help us figure out how we can sort of make recommendations or tweak our system to really drive that performance environment. I mean, to be talking about a Mac Pro and IOPS in the same sentence, it's kind of an interesting dichotomy at MacStadium. Let's talk a little bit about automation. Obviously, CI, the whole breadth of being able to automate builds, automate tools, and you mentioned a couple of other tools that you have used and integrated into your environments. How would you characterize the tool environment, the tool companies? I know there's a new one that crops up. It seems like every month. But what are those values that they can deliver to you that you're looking for in your environments?
Yeah, so I mean, the key value that we're really looking for is the ability for us to just focus on having as much as possible checked into source code so we can identify where problems happen. When you're doing things manually or you're doing something where it's not checked into source code, like it's hard to pinpoint where the problems are at. And so that was something that was integral for us. So that's where Terraform and Ansible can really help people out for provisioning their infrastructure. And so in other parts of our organization, we use AWS. So we also do Windows builds and we use AWS for that. And so we do similar stuff using Ansible and Puppet actually to do the provisioning on that side. But this is something we didn't have before on the MacStadium side. So before we actually used to manage a lot of these VMs manually. So bringing in something like Terraform made it a lot easier for us, and it made it easier so if we were to do a configuration change, like it's tied to the source code. So if all of a sudden developers start reporting problems, I can be like, okay, well, what changed on that day versus before? It's like I'd ask my team and nobody really remembers. We could probably audit the logs on VMware's side, but that doesn't seem like the right way to do this. So I would say that's where the power of it really comes to be from our side. The other part would be being able to revert back to snapshot is a piece of automation that we use the vSphere API for. So that's really integral for us. It allows us to ensure that we get clean builds for every VM. So to us, it's just, I guess, knowing what is available out there. And like Greg said, there's a lot of tools that are changing all the time. So I just try to see what other people are using. I'm not really trying to reinvent the wheel at my organization. I feel like there's a lot of organizations out there that have already probably solved this problem. And so figuring out what's out there and reusing it is typically the way that I approach these kind of problems.
Are a lot of folks working to support iOS teams internally? Good mix. So I think one of the things that we saw as an interesting challenge was just how to keep up and how to have something that could ultimately scale to their needs. So the way our setup today works is we still have some Fusion hosts that we ran previously. We create templates where we'll take, we have a bakery where we'll store the last good image. We'll add the new version of Xcode, we'll add new versions of SwiftLint and other tools that the devs are requiring. We'll then check that in, and then ultimately that will run through some automated processes we have to send that to vCenter. And then once it's in vCenter, we use Terraform to go ahead and be able to deploy that. And then we use Ansible after that to set up some configuration on the VM, set up some of the network stuff, and then ultimately there's some Python scripts that will tell Jenkins where those live. And then Jenkins can connect to those as nodes that it can use for execution. And in the middle, there's a validation step where we have a Jenkins pipeline that captures all these steps and enables you to say, I need to destroy the old VMs, I need to deploy the new VMs. And during that process, we run a series of checks to make sure that some of the paths are set up correctly and we haven't accidentally removed our VM or something else that the developers actually need. We're continuing to work to improve that overall set of testing. And a lot of our internal customers will actually share the repository where those tests live and give them the opportunity to contribute tests they want to have run before the VMs are considered good to be in service. That's another thing that we've found very powerful as we've been evolving our automation journey, was actually empowering the folks that are depending on the tools to help define what we do to consider a VM ready for service. And then finally, we run an iOS app on the Mac stuff and an Android app that does UI test and unit test, just to make sure also functionally things are working as we'd expect. So that's the other thing. As we've been maturing, we've been adding a lot more checks on top to make sure what we're rolling out there is not going to cause problems for folks.
You know, what I love about this is I'm also taking mental notes. So there's a lot of similarities, funnily enough. In fact, I shudder to think about what the world was like before Terraform. It feels so long ago, and yet it was only like a year and a half or 2 years ago. But having Terraform and Packer scripts and Chef and Puppet, Ansible, all of these, it's all about documentation, really. Like how we manage our infrastructure is about using this tooling as a method of documentation with pull requests for the team so we can see what changes are being made and then how are they applied, and then keeping logs and state. We use Terraform very extensively across our organization for building VMs across Linux and for Mac, and also for rolling out changes to vSphere. We've also built CLIs to interact with MacStadium and vSphere to check in and out Mac Pros when we may need to do maintenance to something. And we use a lot of Golang for the CLIs as well. So, it's all about automation for us. So the less that we have to use VNC or, the HTML client or the Flash client back in the day, the more that everything can be automated, the better it is for us.
Internally, MacStadium is also using automation. Mainly we're using mixtures of PowerCLI, Python, and Ansible to do testing before turning over these environments to customers. So traditionally, before working at MacStadium, I would have one vCenter with a ton of virtual machines in it that I'd have to manage. Now, working at MacStadium, it's a little different from my personal case, is that now I have, hundreds, thousands of vCenters that I have to manage or make sure, okay, this customer is having this customer is doing this customer is doing this.
Right.
Okay, we turned over this environment. There's one little setting that's missing from here. Okay, and then that causes, builds are failing. You can't figure it out. So utilizing automation, we're able to say, okay, this works. Every environment that we turn over is exactly the same. We're trying to do that to clean things up because, one little thing missed, your logs might not catch it. You might not even realize, okay, because this has been turned off, or, simple little things, or, vMotion is not enabled on that one host. You're trying to create builds, and vCenter's just spitting out errors saying, okay, I can't build anything. I can't do that. So automation's been pretty huge in that case.
Yeah. One of the things that we've heard from our customers and prospects is they just don't want to manage it anymore. And a lot of that's really true for the software that they're running as well. Josh, I'd like to ask you specifically, since Travis CI has a hosted CI platform as well as a basically on-prem version. I keep hearing Jenkins over here, and I'm like, going like this, but because Jenkins does not have a hosted platform. But what are some of the customers that you have in particular that will choose either the hosted version or the on-prem version, and do they migrate between the two?
Sure. So we've got travisci.com and .org. That's a longer story about why there's two. And then we've got Travis CI Enterprise, which is our on-prem solution, which we've got large customers like IBM, which will be running it for their own security requirements and needs, which connect to GitHub Enterprise. And one of our customers, Shipstead, is a customer as well of MacStadium, uses the exact setup that we use for running Mac builds. And what we generally see is this difference. It's a really funny topic for me of private clouds, because back in the day, we talked about the cloud as being, AWS. And then the cloud kind of moved to being VPCs, like being this kind of private cloud. And this is exactly how we see MacStadium. It's just a private cloud of Macs. It works just in the same way. We've got APIs. And what we want to do is provide the same kind of interface that we use for interacting with, for running our CI solution for our private customers, where the private cloud is really just a contract. And because we're adhering to this contract, we can pass over the same contract to our customers so they can plug it in to the vendor that we recommend. So Shipstead is running Mac builds for their needs, and I believe we're working on a shared case study about how we use Mac builds with MacStadium and Travis CI. But yeah, does that partially answer it?
Yeah,
I get a little bit rambly at times. I'm sorry.
That's kind of right. That's kind of right. Let's shift gears a little bit to security. I mean, I'm sure everyone in the room and the companies that you work in, security is really paramount and getting more and more important from all the data protection laws, data privacy laws, GDPR. Same thing holds true in the dev environments and how and where those dev environments would live and are deployed. Can you tell me a little about some of the things that have impacted especially in your Mac environments, have impacted you on the security side?
Yeah, I mean, I really think of like specifics that have really impacted us aside from recently when we were doing a renewal with you guys. Our security team had done a re-audit of MacStadium, and all I know is that very thankful for your team working with our security team to make sure all those checkboxes were checked. So many acronyms, I can't remember them all. I heard you mention a couple there. It's not really my domain. All I know is that we were able to get through that, and we have to vet every single cloud vendor that we use. So it's the same thing that we do with AWS, with Azure, with Google Cloud. We use nearly every cloud provider at Box. Different teams use them for different purposes. And so for us, security is a huge concern. We're managing customer data, and that's just it's not something that we want to worry about, and we actually can't use cloud providers unless they maintain all of the security requirements that we have. I don't remember what they are off the top of my head, to be completely honest. But yeah, that's what I could say.
I think similar from our side, being on the engineering side of a financial services company, security is a massive concern. So one of the things before we were able to really start working with the MacStadium platform was a very thorough evaluation. And there's kind of continued checks to make sure that it's ultimately providing something that meets the needs of the company's standards. The other thing that's been nice about being in an environment that we ultimately control, we're in an isolated environment, we have the opportunity to connect that back to some of our development environments, to another trusted environment that we control. So that's been another thing on the security front that's been helpful for us to be able to have some connectivity from our Mac environment where you're going to have iOS simulators running to be able to talk to internal APIs and be able to validate some of those tests.
So there's kind of like two levels to this question for me. On the first one is what virtual machines give us. So that is the security that we require for running untrusted code in a multi-tenant situation, because we don't know what one person's code is going to do and try to interfere with someone else's code. So, security is paramount in the isolation, not just CPU and memory, but networking. The other side of it is our code is all open source. And we do this in such a way so we can share how we do it, but we can also do it in such a way that if people detect a better way that we can do something, then, we're all open source on GitHub, people can contribute. So it's partially security by means of community involvement, but security in the sense of how we're utilizing the platform and why we're utilizing a certain technology.
So Preston, on the infrastructure side of MacStadium, are there any of the Cisco enhancements, firewalls, those kind of things that are also complementing those higher security requirements today?
Well, one major thing is that there's no shared cloud at MacStadium. So
True.
Unlike lots of other cloud providers, you're not getting a virtual machine for your virtual private server that sits on the same host or sharing anything. So right now, everybody from the firewall on down is dedicated to an individual. That also plays in partially to the point of needing a hidden API for their calls to automate everything, is that you're not sharing the API. That vCenter belongs strictly to each individual customer. Sometimes that may create a difference in manageability because each person's doing something different, so the problems may come out differently. But it also isolates that a problem that hits Box is not the problem that's going to hit Travis CI or Capital One. That's just you. It won't affect anybody else.
Right. Actually, you bring up a good point. This is one of the questions I get often about well, why can't I just spin up a Apple environment, Apple virtualized environment, and basically buy by the drink, like I can at AWS or at Azure. And the reason is because Apple does not allow that. So every deployment at MacStadium is dedicated, whether it's a single mini or 100 Mac Pros or 1,000 minis. You've got root level access to that, so you've got the full control over what goes in, what goes out, full visibility to that, whereas we as the supplier did not have access to your data, did not have access to your guest OSs. That's the kind of abstraction that we've been forced to build in, but actually welcome building in as well, because it really separates the security responsibility between us. So looking ahead, we talked a little bit about 6.7, and also too, Apple is a hardware company, and as such, they keep coming out with hardware that, it may look like this, it may be this wide, it may be this deep, and so there's some rumors about a new Mac Mini, Mac Pro, the iMac Pro just came out recently. Obviously, Apple hasn't really focused on the enterprise client in quite a while. It's one of the things that we try to sort of do a stopgap on. Are there any of those other technologies that Apple's come out with that you're looking at to implement?
Really not too much. I mean, the advantage for us is that we're running on VMs. So we've got these Mac Pros that are hosted by MacStadium. So we really just want to ensure that we have a stable environment that we can test on. And if there's new hardware that's faster, that's something that we might look to. But this is the advantage, in my opinion, of running on the VMs. You don't have to worry about trying out these, different pieces of hardware. So from our point of view, we're just standardizing on the Mac Pros, and they work pretty well for us.
Yeah, I will echo that. I think a lot of the value we get in running within VMware is we really have the opportunity to configure the environment a little bit differently on top of that same hardware. I think to your point, if there are some performance improvements, that may be a case to consider upgrading some of the underlying infrastructure. But largely, we just want to make sure we have enough capacity and enough speed to keep the developers happy.
I'm going to use my phrase of, well, this is actually on two levels again. Because for us on the CI side, or technically CI side, I guess, there is the question of what's the speed of the CPU, because that greatly affects how fast something runs. Like the newer CPUs just run faster, but then there's also how many cores do you dedicate to a VM, how many gigs of RAM. But the difference, the complexity in that question is, and it all depends on what language you're running on that VM, because if you're running Ruby, for example, then that's bound to one core. Node is bound to one core. But if you're using Swift and Xcode like you should be if you're using Macs, those are multi-core, but are they multi-core during the build process? Are they multi-core during all the other bits that they're doing? So usually the more cores that you give to a VM doesn't necessarily make the build faster. Sometimes you'll kind of like learn where the peak is. So, in part, we want to optimize for developer happiness. Things need to run fast. We need to make it cost effective. But the newer CPUs are going to give us the quickest win. So, the iMac Pros that are coming out, that's really interesting. We haven't experimented with those yet. And we're still yet to do lots of other experiments with giving more cores and making sure that people are using them effectively, because then you get into compiler tricks and how you can actually speed that up. Then there's also caching. So, the land of CI just gets into this fun part of there are actually a million little knobs to tweak, and then there's one big easy knob of like faster CPUs.
It's not by accident, but that's how we racked the iMac Pro. Right there in a data center, because again, it is a faster processor. It's a little bit more supercharged than the Mac Pro, and for certain applications, it really has some value. Well, first of all, I think all of you have kind of answered the really fundamental question. You all sort of had a DIY environment for Mac to basically support your dev teams. And then you moved off to outsourcing that where you could, and then sort of improve it as you go along. I'm sure many of the attendees in the room have lived that same life. Love to just get your final thoughts in terms of just your overall approach and overall environment, and sort of maybe some helpful hints and tidbits for the audience.
Yeah, my recommendations are, like, if you guys have questions, ask us once we have some time, because I'm sure we have very similar questions, or perhaps we don't have the answers, but other people in the audience might have the answers. I think everybody getting out there and just asking the questions that you've got about those environments would be helpful, because I've found the macOS environment to be one of the environments that is not the easiest to find answers on Stack Overflow for. But my final thoughts are kind of echoing what Josh said. The tuning in VMware has been really, really helpful to us. We found that we have a lot of CI jobs that really don't need very many CPU cores. Like, they're running tests and they're running functional tests and they're not doing a build. And so using VMware, we can really leverage these Mac hosts to like their full potential. We can run hundreds of VMs on 12 hosts because they really only need one core to run the operating system and to run some functional tests. And then we can parallelize our functional tests and we can get them done really fast. And then we can also have some VMs that have 8 cores so that they can do our Xcode build as fast as possible. So this is something that's pretty powerful with VMware, I feel like. And it's something that we wouldn't really have the capability of doing if we were doing bare metal hardware. And having an infrastructure provider like MacStadium is huge to us. Like, developers are getting more and more used to just having cloud providers. And I can't tell you the number of times somebody's come up to me and they'd be like, hey, how come we can't just use AWS and just deploy a Mac over there? I'm like, oh man, if I could, I would. But thanks. Obviously, I'm being completely honest. I want the easiest tool for the job. So having something that can resemble that as close to possible is something that MacStadium can provide to us with utilizing VMware. And VMware has some nice automation in there, such as DRS, which allows you to kind of treat it as a cloud as close as possible. I really don't want to have to worry about tuning it and doing things like that. I kind of want that to get figured out by itself. And DRS has some of those capabilities. If you've seen the other talks, you've probably seen more information about that.
Definitely look at your options. I think there are things like Travis out there that you may be able to use and may meet your needs. I think if you find yourself requiring, more secure environment,
then continue to use Travis. Yep.
I'd say invest in the automation and make sure you're able to provide a stable service. A lot of the back and forth we worked with the development teams was getting them to understand the value of consistency, and then helping draw the bounds where they understood when the test fails and the infrastructure is healthy, that means the test is working. That does not mean to call us in panic. And like, the system's broken is what we would hear. And it took a while to gain the confidence of those folks that the tools were working and very healthy. So I think that's something where you'll want to have tests that you can show everything's healthy and push that back on them to figure out why their tests are failing or why somebody committed something that's ultimately breaking the pipeline.
Completely true, because I think a lot of us are very small teams, and when you're that small of a team, that much back and forth just creates so many problems. And completely with you there. It took a while to build that trust because our environment was so unstable for the longest time. And so a lot of times it would be, I'd look at it and I'm like, a test failed? Like, why? That is not my problem. This is CI doing its job. And so once you can get it to be very stable, then you gain the developer's trust and they get what they need to get out of it.
We're having a bit of a debrief in the speakers room before coming here, and we're all talking about kind of like our artisanal, one-of-a-kind setups. Like, we've all got little differences, but what we also realized is that there is a tremendous amount of similarities. We're all doing maybe something a little bit differently to achieve a different means, but it kind of reminded me of how we do it. We need to talk about it more. So there's more that we as Travis want to talk about how we use VMware, how we use MacStadium, but how we essentially provision 55,000 VMs per day and why we do it in a certain way and how we build these VMs. And also how we need to share more so we can actually bring improvements across this. I think the biggest improvements that are coming to VMware that we've seen incrementally throughout the years have been the automation improvements that they've built into the APIs, because for us, we don't want to open up, the HTML5 client and, click around. We want this to be as automated as possible so we can hook this into CI jobs, we can hook this into CLIs that our developers can run, when doing maintenance tasks. And, as you said, we've got an incredibly small team. We're across the 6 million builds that we're doing per month, and those are builds, not jobs, we've only got 2 people on our Mac team. And while we've got 8 people in our infrastructure team, that's 2 people on Mac servicing our VMware cluster, working with MacStadium, working with our developers and how to make that better. So, a lot of this is us planning for how we can continue to grow it, because Mac use is not shrinking. I'm betting there's 80% of people here have got an iPhone. You're all here because you're interested in Mac in some shape or form. Is that an iPhone or your? Yep, there we go. Okay. Okay, at least we've got one person here with an iPhone. Right. So yeah, I think that's me kind of sidetracking and waffling a bit.
I'd say one thing to breach off that point is that MacStadium wants to facilitate a place where not only you use our infrastructure, but where everybody can collaborate. It goes to that same point. Everybody has the same chain of thing that they have to do and accomplish, and many people, they're not stepping on each other's toes. Right. They're internal. We're trying to get something done, and like anything else, the community is a huge portion of that. So sharing that back on how things work is what we want to be able to do, because that one small company may have figured out how to do something that multi-billion-dollar companies might not have seen, and that's the difference in everything running perfectly well.
If we're not competing on best practices, your companies may be competing on your core products, and that's fine. But if we can share those best practices, everybody wins. One final question, since you brought it up. AWS. Some of our customers, as you know, you can't run macOS on a Windows machine. You can run Windows and Linux on a Mac machine.
Right.
And so a couple of our customers who have spun up environments and are working them well through their CI process for Mac builds, they're contemplating or have already brought over some of their Android builds. I'm just curious, this is not a test, I'm just curious, have you considered that as well?
Yeah, so my team is very, very small. We can barely support the desktop applications team and technically the mobile team, but it's really just the iOS side.
Yeah.
So the Android side today, they don't actually utilize AWS themselves. Like I was mentioning, Box is very different depending on what team you're on. So they use core productivity engineering teams infrastructure, which is actually in-house infrastructure, which is, I forget what it is, to be completely honest. But I don't really deal with the Android side of things. Okay. I do know that we do have some Blade servers hosted by you guys. We run a DHCP server there. We do run some Windows machines that we need to have them as long running. So AWS, one of the good things you can do there is you can spin up a machine and then you can throw it away and you can pay for it for its usage. But if you have something longer lived, that's not really the best purpose. Or it wouldn't be my recommendation to run that necessarily on AWS. So that would be something that we're actually looking to bring over to the Blade servers, stuff that we do continuous testing on for our staging environment for functional testing, for example. We could run it on AWS, but it's a little bit more expensive.
Got it.
And I can talk to that a little bit. We run Android emulation on HP blades that live in our MacStadium environment, and that's really because on the Android side, you have the opportunity in AWS to run a lot of your build. That's where we'll run Android build. So we have an Android build pool that we maintain in AWS. We have an Android emulation pool that we maintain on a combination of the Mac and kind of more commoditized hardware. And then we have our iOS build pool that we'll maintain. So that's really the three things that are giving developers on the iOS and Android side the opportunity to run unit tests and run UI tests, as well as all their other build needs.
So right now we use a mixture of AWS and Google for our Linux, and we use MacStadium for our Mac and iOS. We're not looking at moving our hosted usage or hosted Linux over, but what we are interested in is how we can use VMware and Macs with on-prem clients. So when they're using Travis CI Enterprise, they get Mac and Linux and Windows all within one configuration and setup, because it's I guess, less complicated licensing-wise, and also less complex than having to have, here's your Linux and here's your Mac. If we can give people the simplicity of having an entire CI set up on VMware, we see that as a very interesting product.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for sharing your comments, insights, and experiences. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to open up the floor for questions. I'm sure you've got some intimate questions you'd like to ask the panel.
I actually have a question. Yes. What do you guys, maybe for the MacStadium guys, how do you guys deal with managing the infrastructure? Do you have the out-of-band stuff? In some of the pictures, it looked like you guys have external PCI chassis for maybe 10 gig cards, but I didn't see anything for management. How do you guys deal with that?
As far as managing like ESXi and things like that.
So I'm talking about like if you have a drive fill, you have a PSOD or something like that. Is there anything that you can do so you don't have to actually be in the physical co-location space? Like,
depending on what kind of hardware is actually sitting there, you can do remote boots is basically what we give access to the customer. So even through the dashboard, they have access to the power controls. And with Apple hardware, you can set things to do, reboot or restart on power on, and you can set that.
But like with an HP, for
example, knock on wood, our mean time to failure on the Mac hardware is really, really low. So, and in most of our data centers, we have full-time staff, who are, especially with the Mac Minis.
So, like with an HP, you can remote into an ILO, you can get console access, but you don't have it with the Mac. How do you? So do customers just not have visibility if for some reason it's not responding to ping, or they can't spin up a VM or something like that, and they just reach out to you guys, and then you guys reboot it or something like that? So is it more?
Essentially, that would work because nobody's running, like a single host or two hosts. Everybody has multiple hosts. So you have internal alerting that'll say, okay, this host is not responding. We're actually working on some extra deeper alerting because the one problem we have, it being Apple hardware, even hearing from VMware, Apple hardware is a black box. So you have new features in 6.5 like proactive HA, for instance, that can work on HP, that can work on Dell, that can work on Cisco UCS. That can't work on Apple because nobody has any idea what's internally working on it. No clue what's going on there. So essentially, we rely on alerting and VMware saying, okay, this host is not responding, or the management network not responding, and then proactively basically removing that host from the cluster and putting a new one in its place. And then on the side, we can worry about, okay, what caused that one specifically to fail? Everything just continues on. HA does its job, VMs and builds keep going, and transparent to what their customers maybe or internally they're doing, they can keep running while that happens in the background and moving it in and out.
So, and in some cases, we have a non-Mac or HP blade cluster for management of the Mac environment, and then you both utilizing the SAN for basically stored images and so forth.
And also, I heard you guys talk a little bit about the builds or the OSs that you make available to your customers or the end users. How do you generate those? Are there any specific tools used to build the OS and get Xcode on it, or does someone do it by hand? Is there no automation?
Yeah, so for our desktop team, it's actually mostly done by hand.
Okay.
For the iOS team, we use Ansible for most of the provisioning, so we'll take like the base ISO file, and then there's some things that we'll do manually. I don't really recall. I don't work on the iOS templates very much. So some of the things that, like, for example, if it's going to take like a 16-line Apple script, we might just do that one time manually and then save that as an image and then never mess with that again, and then build off of Ansible on top of that. So that's what we do.
And the last question, do you guys use APFS at all? I know that it's not necessary with like Xcode. Have you dealt with it at all?
Yes. So got APFS working in 6.7, and essentially, so with 6.5, you have to create like essentially a little hack and to ignore APFS to get 10.13 running.
So basically, it told it to install an HFS Plus instead. Then.
Yeah. But now with 6.7, APFS is natively supported. So essentially, the only thing you're doing is via terminal before you boot up that virtual machine with the ISO attached is to configure and format the storage. Outside of that, it runs perfectly normal. So 6.7
do you have a lot of requests for it, or is it very uncommon?
What'd you say?
Do you have a lot of requests for APFS?
Now, yes, with the fact that 10.14 is coming out very soon. Get lots of requests on, hey, when is 6.7 supported?
Do you have any concerns with when you have a mass upgrade once Mojave comes out, that there's going to be a lot of need to do that?
Well, when it started with 6.5 that they added in like Update Manager directly, that was a big help. So it no longer puts the burden on us to say, okay, we have to shut down everything. We got to rebuild everything for a customer, or we got to have running separate update managers. As part of vCenter, you can do it. What we're doing now is empowering the customer to be able to have access to their vCenters. That's the way we're going towards that. So you run your update, and ta-da, there it is. You just basically do the updates for it. It's been a little tough sometimes with the multiple changes in ESXi coming out, where VMware, if you're running on Dell or any other standard hardware, everything seems to work perfectly fine. Then you try it on Apple hardware, and things are clearly broken. We ran into that with 6.5, the GA release. A lot of customers wanted to move to it, and the internal M2 drives, basically they removed one of the drivers that was present in like 5.5 and 6, and it was not present in 6.5, and we were wondering, like, okay, well, what's happened? Your
I
IOPS
think originally they didn't list the Mac Pro on the HCL,
yes.
and then they added it
and
after.
And then they added it,
yeah.
yes.
Right. And as a VMware partner too, we very, very frequently provide that real-time or that real-life comment back to VMware for their development folks, and which they then feedback to Apple too, because at some point it'd be nice to get them in the same room, but that'll never happen.
Yeah. Well, thanks for answering the question.
Thank you. Thank you. And the question?
Yeah, I have
yes, sir.
I have a couple questions too, along the same line as the infrastructure questions. How do you guys handle firmware updates to the Mac hardware that only get released in macOS upgrade cycles, and also the networking side of it? How do you guys get like 10G to the backend SAN with the limitations of the Mac hardware?
Preston?
So essentially, we use hardware boxes from Sonic that connect to the Mac Pros, and that enables us to utilize 10 gig and fiber channel. That throughput has been a saving grace, because otherwise you have your standard 1 gig copper, which really, everybody here pretty much knows that, look, Apple does not, they're not enterprise. None of this stuff is enterprise. So you have to basically, use a little elbow grease to get these things to work in that sense. That as far as firmware goes, we have done some updates to it based on, depending on when that hardware was actually released, but we've noticed from the VMware side that there wasn't this need to constantly, keep up with the change, because it didn't really make too much difference. It was more on the bare metal side versus, ESXi side. I heard from VMware that they do a lot of guesswork on getting ESXi to run on Mac, simply because they really just don't know. Like a memory pointer, for instance. Okay, well, what does this do? I don't know. Let's just see what it does. Oh, look, it works. All right, we're good. We're set.
Yeah. I mean, these are some of the things that we've spent our time and energy working on. We've got 6 patents around how we rack and stack Mac infrastructure. I mean, Mac Mini's got a single power supply. In a data center, you've got A and B. Well, we create C. So we deliver A and B power to every single Mac device, even a Mac Mini. This is our patented sled, where it has a PCI Express Sonic box with some additional connectors to it, dual 10 gig NIC cards, as well as fiber to the SAN. So we've taken that, again, the Mac Pro in particular, and added the right connectivity, the right structure to it, to modularize it, to make it work in a data center. And then it becomes a very scalable Mac resource, just like an HP Blade, or a Windows, or Dell, and a few else's in the room here. Yes, sir.
Hi. I work for a college in California, so one of the things is that our whole infrastructure at the college is VDI. So we don't have true computers on anything. One of the questions I have is, anybody thought about we have a programming class that's interested in Xcode, and for us to spend $20,000 on Mac computers is just not reasonable. Has anybody thought about just virtualizing the Xcode program and getting it onto Horizon 7? Or is that even possible? I'm willing to work with Mac.
I'll take the answer from the infrastructure side. We have a university in London that uses we have a VDI software component. In fact, we just acquired the company that does that. So with 75 Mac Minis in a resource pool that they can expose to the VDI as a basically virtual VDI, virtual Mac instance to the students.
Okay.
So again, it's that one-to-one relationship, but instead of buying 70 minis for that session, that mini is now allocated to that virtual instance of the mini using the VDI software. So there are ways to really do that, as opposed to hacking into all the Xcode and that kind of stuff. So it's more on the infrastructure side.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, sir. We've got time for probably one more question, and we saved it for you.
Very kind. More of a selfish question. You're obviously running a SAN system.
Yes.
Is there anything to stop you connecting a smaller number of Macs up and running vSAN across them instead? Have you tried it? Can you run vSAN across
Are you running vSAN?
cluster of Mac Minis instead?
We've done it in testing and done it on Xserves as well. Being that Xserves has been deprecated for quite a while, I'm trying to figure out, well, what do we do with all this hardware? And we've run vSAN on there, but the performance has really been somewhat sketch, mainly because hardware for the HCL. There are ways to get the Mac Pro running on there as well, like Atto, I believe is the company, has external hard drive. So you keep the M2 drive internally for cache and then storage on the external. It works, but we've seen better performance gains from still just keeping two standard, Fibre Channel or IP-based storage versus the vSAN. And not necessarily sure if that's based on the Apple hardware itself, or something else in the ether that's happening. It's not as quick.
So you could use the external PCI boxes, have a PCI hard drive in there, have your 10 gig connectivity as well.
Yeah, because essentially you still meet the requirements, and the fact that the Apple Mac Pro is on the HCL, it is technically supported. Right.
That'll do for me.
So thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Again, we're here for any questions afterwards. I encourage and ask you to please fill out your survey. Thank you very much for your time, and again, thanks again for coming.